And each time there's, I assume, different memories come about.
Yes.
Okay. Now we're back and rolling. So, just the idea of no sleep, no food, cold, wet.
Yeah, it was like when we'd stop during the day in the barns. They would lock us up in these barns, and we'd crawl up in the hay. And the first time we did that, my feet were so cold, and I took my shoes off, and I stuck my feet way down in the hay, thinking it'd be insulated and be warm down there. And I fell asleep. But you'd be asleep for a little while, and then pretty soon you'd wake up, your feet aching from cold. They were still cold down in that hay. Well, when they finally told us to get out on the road again, my feet had swelled, and I had a hard time getting my shoes back on. So after that, I never took my shoes off again. And the only food we got on while we were on this long march into Germany was we'd steal, I don't know what they were, rutabagas or what, but we called them cow beets. They fed their cattle. And we'd steal some of those, and I'd have one of those in my pocket, and I'd chew on that once and that was all I had for food.
Did you have to sneak that? I mean,
Yeah.
Did they scold you if they caught you?
Yeah. Although one village I remember we went through, and it was still daylight a little bit, some lady was reaching out her window, kind of looking up and down, and would hand out an apple as we went by. I suspected she might have had maybe a son that was a prisoner in this country or something. But, and the guy next to me, he got one of these apples, but I didn't. And I'm telling you, that listening to him eat that apple just drove me bananas. It just, that was hard to take. And I kept watching him, and he was getting close to the end of it. I said, would you save the core for me? And he didn't leave much on that core. But he gave me what was a little bit left of it. I never eat an apple again without when I get down to the end of that, it comes all to mind.
It's interesting because I always would have thought from movies and all that prisoners, the biggest thing on their mind would have been girlfriends or things like that. But all of them that I've talked to, you just touched on what they've told me. One of the things that kept them alive and thinking about was food.
Food, that's right.
If I understand right, Lawrence Schwizow, it was flapjack.
Yeah.
And he still to today, every morning has a stack of pancakes and syrup. I mean, 50-some years later, 60 years later.
When we were in prison camp, when we finally got there, we'd sit around and talk. It always was about food. It might start sometime with some guy talking about going out with his girlfriend to do something, but immediately it was to the restaurant, and he started talking about the food. And we all had our fantasy of what food we were going to get when we got home. If we could have, we'd all died if we'd have got home too quick, I'm sure, because we would have done ourselves in eating. My fantasy was I was going to buy either a quart brick of ice cream, put one of those big chocolate bars on each side for it, and make a sandwich out of ice cream and chocolate. Everything you thought about was something that was really rich, something that was really going to cure that hunger. Or the other thing that I always liked, blackberry or boysenberry pies. But I'd go to a bakery and buy a whole pie and then put a quart of ice cream on top of it. That's one of the sad facts of life, is that you can't catch up. You can't realize your fantasy.
Do you have any idea how many miles you hiked?
No, I don't know. I've driven that since then, but it was all the way from the Kirch Luxembourg. I walked all the way to the town of Limburg, east of the Rhine.
So can you give me a ballpark idea? Cities here, how far? Just a ballpark. Like from Olympia to...
Oh, it was... It's hard. Everything's different, so different over there. It's hard to visualize because you go through so many little... Like here, if you go from say from where we live in Belfair to Olympia. In the old days, when the old highway used to wander all around, it seemed like a long ways. Now you whiz down here in a few minutes on the freeway. So it's hard to visualize what the mileage was, because we went through most of the like little back roads and wound around all over, up and down through the valleys, down across the Moselle River and up the other side, and then on down across the Rhine. And I just don't know what it was. It took us about 2 weeks to make the march.
Long way, long distance. Mm-hmm. Now, as you went through these villages, were a lot of them still standing? Operating?
Yes. They were most of those little villages weren't harmed in any way. The big cities, as we were marching in there, it was nighttime. You could see all around the entire horizon to the east of us, and even north and south. The whole sky was aglow with a red glow from the burning big cities. And that's what I used to think of it. That was as close as I was getting into the Valley of the Shadow of Death, because what I was virtually witnessing was the death of a nation.
The little towns, the villages that were still standing, were they functioning? I mean, was it like...
Yes.
So it was like, kind of, except for prisoners marching through, it was like the war wasn't going on?
Well, a lot of times when they'd come through, that would go through the little village, a lot of the people would be standing out alongside the road and watching us march through. And like the ground was frozen, the snow was frozen hard on them, and the Germans in their old hobnail boots. And when they would come through the city, these German troops would marching us, would fix their bayonets and really start strutting, and then they'd slip and fall and go down, laterally bang and clang, and well, the first time we all laughed, and they came up swinging rifle butts, and we thought, no, we better not laugh anymore. But after that, we just grinned ourselves in the side and think, because we had composition soles in our shoes, we didn't slip like they did. But that was kind of one of those little sources of satisfaction to us that.
So they made a parade out of you then?
Yeah, they would. See, that was the difference between combat troops and non-combat troops. The combat troops treated us better than these troops did, because they were fighting the war with us. I mean, and
had that mutual respect and understanding.
We were their enemy, and this was their only contact with us. So.
Did the civilians treat you that were along the street? Were they yelling things, or were they just like...
Just watching us. But we were, a lot of times they would stop us in the town, or maybe our guards would go in and get a cup of hot coffee or something to eat or something. They left us all standing in the streets, and a lot of us had dysentery. You had to pull your pants down and go right there in the street in front of all these people watching, So it was kind of a dehumanizing aspect.
When you finally got to the camp, now you ended up at which?
The first stalag I got to was at Limburg. It was Stalag 12A. And we had, at our last stage there, when we went across the Rhine River, they marched us down and put us on a big barge, took us across the river on an open barge with a tugboat pulling it across. And boy, I really was fearful that some fighter plane would see us, and that would have really done us in. But we made it. And when we finally got to Stalag 12A, we got just inside the camp, just about the time it was getting dark. And they marched us into this, they had a great big white, it's like a circus tent in there. And inside the ground was just covered with snow and packed down like ice. And they marched us in, and they left us standing in there all night long, after we had been walking all day for days and days. And because you couldn't sit down on that ice, and so you just had to stand all night. And then when daylight finally come, a German officer finally showed up outside with some other men, and they told us that we would come out, that we would have to come up to this desk, and give them our name, rank, serial number, and our organization that we were from. Well, this was taboo. You're not supposed to tell that, only your name and rank and serial number. And there was one big, tall MP from our division who was right up front there, and he objected. No, we don't have to do that. And he wouldn't do it. And this old German officer is, I will show you what happens when you disobey a German officer. Joel pointed to one of the men and said, take this man out and shoot him. Well, they stood him off to the side. And then there was still a big hubbub on it. Finally, they said, well, all the men from such and such a unit over here, all the men from the engineers over here, all the men from artillery over here, and so forth. Well, it's the same thing they were going to find out. So I was way in the back, and I just spoke up and said, go to somebody else's unit. And I went to this engineer's unit. You know. But after they had got all separated into units, then they counted them all, put us all back together then, and took us over to this old so-called barracks, which was nothing but a shell of a building with just a thin scattering of straw on the floor. There was almost wasn't enough room for everybody to lay down on the floor in there. And they didn't shoot that guy. They finally brought him in after it was all over. But he thought for a while he was going to be shot.
Was it a work camp? Or was
No,
it
was just a big prison camp. And they had, it was a permanent prison camp, and they had men of all nations in there and lots of Americans. And, excuse me. But we weren't there very long. Everything was froze up. The sanitary facilities were just terrible, almost non-existent. And we got fed one little can with watery cabbage soup in it a day, and that was our food. And after about 4 or 5 days there, they lined us all up and marched us out. And we got right down to the main gate of the prison camp to leave again. And 4 P-38s came over and were dive bombing the railroad yards down in Limburg, which was about 2 miles from us, I guess. So we waited then until the P-38s got through and left. And then they marched us on down to that railroad yard and put us in boxcars. I didn't know it at the time, but a lot of the guys were already down there in those boxcars when it was being dive bombed. And they got us all in those boxcars. They had us jammed in those boxcars so tight that you had to sit there with your legs drawn right up tight to you. And they were just, everybody was just packed like sardines. And then they left us sit there. And the train didn't move for a long time. We kept worrying, that some planes would come back and get us. Well, eventually we did start rolling, but it was very slow and jerky, and they stopped many times, places, and the only way we had, there was a little ventilator way up high, and we'd boost one guy up every time the thing stopped, so he could look out through the slots and see where we were, see what was going on. And if we looked out and saw that the guards running away, why, we knew that we were going to get attacked again. And this happened several times, but fortunately, we never got hit. And the only way we could relieve ourselves was to urinate against the crack in the door of the boxcar. They never opened it. And there was one can. There must have been 100 men in this car. One can, and it was full immediately. And the poor devils that had to sit next to that. But you could sit just so long, and by then we had already been a prisoner almost a month, and we were pretty skinny, and your legs would go to sleep because you didn't have any meat on your bones. You're sitting there. So you'd stand up when your legs started to go to sleep. And after you stood for a while and had to sit down again, there wasn't room to sit down. Everybody had just kind of expanded a little, with the pressure off. And you had to really work your way down get a place to sit again. And this is the way we went for 4 days. And no water, no food. The only food that I had in that 4 days was, before we got on the train, they gave us 3 little cakes of cheese that were about the size of a snooze can, about that big around, about that thick. And that's all I had to eat in 4 days in there, and no water. They say you can't go that far along without water, but we did. And we finally, when we got pulled into New Brandenburg, there up north of Berlin, and they opened up and let us out. Boy, when I slid off of the boxcar to the ground, my legs almost didn't hold me up. And I'd been I hadn't had a bowel movement in, I don't know, weeks now. And I had hemorrhoids from sitting on that cold floor and lack of everything else. So bad, I was really in pain. Couldn't hardly walk. And as we walked out of the railroad yards, we passed another train that they were unloading. The Russian prisoners had been brought in. And there we saw them unloading the results of cannibalism. Those Russians had been in their cars longer than we had. And we had to walk about 3 miles out to the prison camp, Stalag 2A. And when we got in there, the guys had some pieces of Red Cross parcels left, and they gave us some food from it. And they said, go very easy on that. And I thought I did, but boy, when that food started working and my inside started working again, I thought I was going to explode. Oh man, I was tied up in knots. It was terrible. And the food in this camp was, when we first got there, was what we called grass soup. It looked like somebody had pulled weeds out of something and put them in some boiling water. And sometimes we got a couple of little boiled dirty potatoes, still with the skin and dirt on them. And we'd get one little chunk of bread about that thick once a week. And that bread was made with sawdust. They used wood flour, and even down in the bottom of the loaf of bread, you could actually find chunks of sawdust. And it was hard to eat even fresh, but we'd try to make that little chunk of bread last till we get our next piece the next week. And by the time, after a few days, that stuff was just as hard as could be. One kid actually broke his tooth eating it. It was that hard.
Do you have any idea what weight you were down to at this point? How light?
No. When we arrived at this prison camp, the first thing they did was run us into a building, and they said they were going to fumigate our clothes and give us a shower. Well, we were a little concerned. We thought we might be the ones gassed and the clothes might be the ones that get washed. And so they took all our clothes off and put them on racks. And when I'd got my clothes off, I looked down at myself, and I looked away real quick. I thought I was looking at somebody else. I did not recognize myself. I was so skinny. Then I realized, hey, that was me I looked at, not somebody else. But I had that first feeling, you'd want to stare at this other guy with his clothes off. And I looked away, and that was me. And looked down, and holy smokes. That kind of worried us a little bit.
Because you probably hadn't even seen a mirror.
No, nothing.
Your face, your body, or anything for.
No, we hadn't had our clothes off there for a month. And when they finally, they'd take out a little group, and we never saw them again. We were still concerned whether we were aware of the fact that the Germans had these concentration camps where they were gassing people, And it was getting kind of worrisome, because we didn't see anybody when they got through. And finally, when my turn came, they put us in this big square room that was lined with galvanized sheet metal come through. It was real high. You couldn't reach you'd see these spigots way up there in the overhead. And they told us, to stand under this thing, and the water would squirt on, and we were to soap up, and then the water would turn off, and after a while we'd get another shot to rinse us off. Well, we were still concerned whether there was going to be gas or water come out of that thing. And so apparently when they turned their water off, they must have drained the water out of the pipes so it keep it from freezing. Because when they turned it on, first thing you heard was this little swish air. And we thought, oh, it is gas. But and there wasn't a damn thing you could do. There was everything was too high up, and the door was shut and locked. And it was kind of momentarily pretty scary until the water started. And it just barely got you wet, and almost enough to get soaked up. And then you wait for it for another little squirt came. You almost didn't get enough to get rinsed off. And that was our so-called shower. Then we went out in this other room where we saw the other guys. And then they brought our clothes in. They supposedly had been gassed. Well, up to that time, we didn't have any lice yet. I think they were keeping the lice in this camp pure because that's where we got the lice and the bed bugs.
Was the shower warm or cold?
It was warm.
So that was probably the first time in a month that you had even felt warmth by this time? Or?
Well, it wasn't really warm. It was lukewarm, but it wasn't chilly cold. It was tolerable. Let's put it that way. But it wasn't a nice warm shower.
Huh. And then you got your uniform back.
Yeah.
It came through and with lice and bed bugs and.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have them yet, but as soon as we got into the barracks, well, then we got our bed bugs.
Was this prison camp built as a prison camp? Or
Yes.
It was.
It was built, I think, by Russian and Polish prisoners early in the war, like in 1939. But by now it was pretty ramshackly. It was a very depressing looking place. There was no color at all in it. And in our barracks, it was just big old 3-tiered wooden bunks with just some wooden slats in there and a little thin bag, a burlap bag of straw for a mattress. And between the two ends of the barracks, there was originally a washroom, but there was no running water in it because everything was shut off because of the cold. And there was no heat in the barracks. And like I say, the food was lousy. But eventually we did get Red Cross parcels at this camp, and that was the godsend. I always feel like I owe the Red Cross my life, because if it hadn't been for that, we'd have been like the Russians. The Russians had no Red Cross parcels. And there would be about 6 dead Russians out in front of their barracks every morning. And the Russians would come through our compound and go through our garbage, like where we had a Red Cross parcel and we'd thrown away a can. There was nothing in that can, but maybe there might have been a little grease where you had a can of like corned beef or something. And they would pick up that can and they'd run their finger around and get that grease off and lick it. And that was what they were. I even saw one of them pick up the cigarettes were a very short supply for those who smoked. And when they smoked them down to the bitter end almost. And I remember one guy had thrown us down, and outside of our barracks there was a latrine at the end of it that was always overflowing around on the ground. I remember seeing this Russian pick up this butt out of this latrine overflow and stick it up and put it in his pocket. He'd save every little bit till they got enough tobacco out of there to make something to smoke. They were in pitiful condition.
So did the nationalities, because it sounds like you had an American barrack and a Russian barrack, but did they intermingle?
No. So
you were kept separate then?
There was a British barracks too right alongside, and even the British kept to themselves.
But not because they were forced to.
No,
it was just natural migration.
Mm-hmm. I know we went over to the British barracks one time and going to try to swap something from our Red Cross parcel with something there. Somebody said that they had some good jam or something. And, oh no, the British, everything British was better than everything. They wouldn't trade.
It's amazing. Some things won't change in war. The British always think they're... I mean, even that aspect of war, the fact of getting a Red Cross package. I mean, as you hear these stories, there becomes this very surreal aspect of war. You're our enemy. We're going to capture you. We now have these rules. The Russians, who we captured, their people don't send them Red Cross packages, so we aren't going to give them. The Americans are sending, so you only get the American ones, and the British get the British ones. Mm-hmm. So it's this, It's hard to understand having
It
never
is.
been there.
It is. Yeah, that's what always bugged me was, so they captured us. We're not fighting them anymore. Why do they have to take the war out on us now and treat us like this? What are they gaining by treating us like this?
What'd they have you do in the camp?
They would take us out on various work details, like we'd go out and cut some trees. I remember that one time they had me cutting big linden trees on the road coming into this camp. And they'd cutting these down and cut them up into pieces. And every morning, see, there was the one end of our barracks was what we called the sick barracks, guys who had sickness or wounds or something. And the barracks that I was in was the able-bodied one. Well, they would fall us out every morning for roll call, and they'd line up the sick barracks in front and the healthy ones in the back. And then after they took roll call, they would excuse the sick barracks to go, and then they would come over to the able-bodied one group standing there and pick out men to take them on work deals. You didn't always get on one, but mostly you did. And in behind us was this huge outdoor latrine that was like a concrete tank above ground or a basement above ground with this building on top of it. And inside was all these little square wooden like boxes with a pyramid top and a hole on each of the four sides of the pyramid. This was your latrine. And it all fell into this great big tank like underneath. Well, they would excuse these sick people, and they would turn and they would go right back through our ranks, and half of us would go with them to the latrine. And then we would set up here in this latrine, and the old guards would run through there trying to pick out who was not sick ones. And I remember going to just sit there and look sad and say, "Ik is krank," which is, I am sick. They couldn't understand why we would do this, and they kept doing this every day. They couldn't learn. And when they would finally nab enough guys and line them up and start marching them out to go to work, guys at the tail end, as they went around the corner of a building, would quick disappear, fall off. And the guard would get down to the main gate, and he'd tell the guard down there he had so many men to take out. So then he would have to count them and verify it. And they'd come up with a different number than what the guy told him he had. So then the two of them would go. And I learned to count German very fast there because I could hear these guys, and it was almost hilarious. We would bug these people like this every way we could, and they could not understand it. So one night, a German officer came in, and they made everybody come out along the aisleway down through all these bunks. And this German officer walked up and down in here and lectured us for a whole hour. And only a few guys knew German. The rest of us, we didn't know what he was talking about. Finally, when he got all through and left, and somebody said, "Well, what was that all about?" And the guy says, "He just said, basically, you're soldiers, why don't you act like soldiers?" They could not understand an American's not wanting to follow orders. A German was a very regimented, good soldier. He did what he was told. We didn't, under these circumstances.
Not by the enemy.
Yeah. Well, we were bad enough even with our own. But the German could not understand that attitude of ours at all. He just could not understand it.
How long were you in that camp? Quite a while?
I was there about 6 weeks, I think. And as the weather was still pretty cool and was getting toward April now, and we were concerned that, boy, when things do get warmer around here, this place is going to be ripe for sickness and everything. And we thought we should get out of there. And we'd heard about guys who had been taken out to what they called Arbeitskommandos, where they took you out and kept you at a work site somewhere. And some of them we heard were good, some of them were bad. But my buddies and I, in this one little quadrangle of bunks, we decided, one of my buddies here was a kid that I had been with in basic training and went to ASTP at the University of Alabama with. and there we'd parted company when I went to the Air Force. And I was just sitting in this thing one afternoon when in comes some new guys, and who should walk in but this old friend of mine. We both looked at each other and said, "What are you doing here?" You know, he thought I was off in the Air Force, and and so at any rate, we got together and we got thinking, maybe we better volunteer for one of these Arbeitskommandos and see what comes of it. So we did, and finally one day they chose us, and about 6 of us were marched back downtown to the railroad station and put on a regular train. The train was made up of passenger cars and freight cars, and every other car was either an open flat car or a gondola with an anti-aircraft gun mounted on it with a crew. But the passenger cars were like the ones in the old Western movies, where the open platform on the ends of the cars wouldn't have a closed vestibule like our trains had. And we got up on that, and so they were going to have to ride outside. And so the guard and the 6 of us were standing out on this platform. Well, it was cold out there, but I figured if planes ever attacked us here, why, at least we could jump off of this thing. And so it wasn't too bad a deal that way. But after we had ridden there quite a while, it was getting pretty darn cold, and the old guard, he wanted to open the door and try to push us inside. Well, inside was standing room only, and there was civilians and German troops and everything else in there. Well, those German soldiers weren't going to have any part of us in there with their civilians, so they pushed us out. The guard was trying to push us in. The guys inside won. So we rode for a while longer outside, and it was kind of like a streetcar almost. This thing stopped and let people on and off all along the way. And eventually enough people got off that we finally got inside to sit down. And by the time it got dark and we were still riding, it was still in the night, it got pretty empty in there. But eventually the thing stopped out in the countryside. We didn't have the foggiest notion where we were and where we were going. And the old guard marched us off up a road, and we were coming through the big open farm fields, and there was poplar trees all on each side of the road. We walked up into this big kind of a quadrangle of buildings, and it was a farm, it looked just like something out of Gone with the Wind. It was a big old, like a mansion up at the end, and the farm buildings down around. And then we saw this one barn with a little barbed wire fence around one corner of it. And I figured, that's where we're going. And sure enough, it had been the pigsty in the barn. It was all a masonry barn, which was nice and tight. But it had been cleaned out and whitewashed. So it was pretty decent in there. And it was warm because the barn was warm. And so it was the best quarters that I had as a POW. And we worked there out in the fields each day, where they had potatoes lined up in long rows in winter storage in the fields. They'd been covered with straw and dirt. And we were digging out these piles of rows of potatoes and throwing them into a big rotary sieve that graded them in little potatoes, medium-sized potatoes, and big potatoes. I didn't know it at the time, but this is what they were using those potatoes to make rocket fuel, alcohol. We thought we were feeding this. We thought we were not helping the war effort here. But for a POW, this was the best place that I had ever been, or had been treated the best. And there was a bunch of Russian slave labor women working in the fields along with us. And we could steal enough potatoes here, so we had plenty of potatoes to eat. We had heard, that we could eat better out to these places, and we did, because but it was nothing but potatoes, just potatoes. But we had almost all you could eat. And when Good Friday came and Easter Sunday, they didn't make us work those days, and they did throw in a chunk of tough, gristly, I don't know what kind of meat it was. So those 2 days we had something else beside in the potatoes. And but the weather was starting to warm up. This was April, and we were again. Spring was coming, and we were starting to come alive a little bit. And so, when we were working out there, these Russian women we'd see them head over to a little clump of bushes there to do their business over, and we'd holler at them, "We know what you're doing. We know where you're going." Well, they caught on to that right quick. No, they seemed to enjoy our horseplay attitude, and so when they'd see us heading for something, they'd just mimic it right back at us. They didn't know in any English, but they knew what we were saying, and so the guards are pretty tolerant here. But at one day they kind of got ticked off that we were playing too much with them, and we found out that their rations were cut because they didn't produce enough work that day. So we had to be a little more careful after that. And then one day when we had been doing that too, the guard came up and took my dog tag and looked at it and wrote the number down, and some of the other guys. And the next day they took us out and took us back down to the railroad tracks. We got on that train again, and they took us to another Arbeitskommando, which was, I don't know, it was a little, I didn't ever know where the farm was I was on. But, one other incident here at the farm that was pretty unusual. There was a funeral in town, and this man that ran the farm, we called the chef, he and his family went to this funeral. And they had a big fancy horse-drawn carriage, just like you see in the movies. And they went to the funeral, and here they were, he was wearing their big old silk top hats and all dressed up and in this big carriage. And we really just felt like we were back in the days of Gone with the Wind, that we were the slaves in the field and there went the master in his carriage. It was just like a mind warp. It was just kind of blew your mind as to this was existing.
Just seeing the picture you just painted, that's the picture I saw as you told it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, a plantation.
Yeah.
And here were the slaves working the plantation.
That's just the way we felt.
Wow.
These poor Russian girls, they had a Polish trader who carried a big bullwhip, kept them in line. But they didn't bother with us Americans because we had our own guard, and he was in charge. But anyhow, when we left us, we went to this other Arbeitskommando, and it was a little village of Krumel, and we knew where that one was found. But they put us in like an old brick house, and they had sickle bars from mowing machines cemented in the windows so for bars. And here we worked in the woods cutting trees and packing out the wood. And life here wasn't as pleasant, but we still had all the potatoes we could eat, and that's all we had was potatoes. And it's not a very pleasant thought or thing. My wife always gives me heck for talking about it, but we ate all the potatoes you could eat. You just eat until eat. You're never satisfied, so you just bloated yourself with it. And then one day out working, and we'd go over to do our business in the brush, and it just looked like a cow had been there. It would come out, it would just flow out, and it was almost the same color as it was when we ate it. And anyhow, I'd been in there, and I'd go in, and you'd squatting down on the ground, and that thing would spread out, and when it get to your heels, you'd move over and start another pile. And I'd been in there quite a while, and this guard came looking for me. And he looked and he said, "Du scheißen ein Uhr." And I pointed to 3 piles, and I moved over and I started another one. He just shrugged his shoulders and left. But that was the way we lived, ate, and lived. And so we worked there quite a long time and at various places. And we were beginning to see a little air activity. And I remember one day an old Junkers 88, one of those old tri-motored corrugated Fokker transports was come flying overhead, pretty low, and a Russian fighter was right after him. And we could see the tracers from that Russian fighter going right through that plane and ricocheting off the wings. And I think they eventually must have killed the pilot because the plane just finally nosed over and disappeared behind the trees. And then pretty soon we heard this big whang, you know, when it hit the ground. And a big column of smoke came up. And another day time we were working cutting wood right across a lake from a German airfield. And they had the German jets, the Me-262s on there. That was mind-boggling. We had never seen a jet. And it was just fabulous. You could see it come right over us real low, and no propellers, and just that whoosh. You know, it was unbelievable. And another day when we were working there, and we saw a flight of B-17s coming over. And we all just quit working and just sat down. We watched the first plane come over and drop his Pathfinder bomb, and they all came in and kept bombing it, and we just sat there like watching an air show. And when the bombers got through, some P-51s came in there and strafed the field, and even the guard, and we all just sat there and watched. And another day, they had us building a roadblock in the woods on a swampy area. And we heard a sound like a P-51 roaring around real low in that area. And we got excited, and the old German saw us, and he said, "It's Deutschflieger." And pretty soon we heard him strafing. And we just turned to the guard and said, "Oh, yeah, Deutschflieger." And about the next instant, I hear this 51 came right over the road, right where we were working, and his wing tips were practically cutting the treetops. And we could look right up in his canopy and see the pilot's face. Oh, that was a most wonderful feeling, because here finally the war was actually getting right to us. And each day we started to be able to faintly hear artillery in the distance. And I don't know, I could hear, sometimes when the weather's right, you can hear the artillery out here at Fort Lewis. Well, that's the way I'd remembered that when we lived here in Tumwater. And that's artillery in the distance. And each day it began to get a little louder. And one day when we came back out of the woods, back to our village of Cromel for the night, there was a lot of German troops in the area, and we thought, something's happening, something's coming up. And the next morning, when the old guard opened the door, unlocked the door to our room, usually he was Lost Arbeit. This time he said something entirely different. And we asked this one kid, what did he say? He says, "Do you want to go meet the Americans, or do you want to wait for the Russians?" And well, we had never trusted him, and we just said, "Tell the bastard to go to hell. We'll wait for the Russians." And he mumbled back something, and it was, "You'll all end up in the salt mines in Siberia." And he left, and a few minutes later he came back. They were going to take us, the Americans, whether we wanted to or not. And the guards marched us over to the main road through the area, and it was just a bedlam of activity. It was loaded with German troops, civilians with wheelbarrows, bicycles, wagons, cars, household goods, everything you could imagine on that road. People were fleeing ahead of the Russians. We even saw one whole group of people from a concentration camp sitting there by the side of the road. They were just like zombies. They didn't even know what was going on. And the place was just utter bedlam. I've never seen such a horrible mass of humanity in my life. And the guards, everything was kind of blocked at this. There was a crossroads there, and so there was a German officer directing traffic here. And so our guards went up to him to tell him something, I don't know what. But pretty soon, I think he told them, "Take us back where you got them," because that's what they did. They came back, turned us around, we went right back to where we'd been kept. And as soon as we got there, our guards disappeared on bicycles, and we were free to do what we wanted. Well, there were German troops all over the area, and I remember one German was sitting there on our doorstep, and he had a pair of little field glasses on him. Well, I still had some cigarettes from a Red Cross parcel. So I got this other kid who could speak German. I said, see if you can buy these field glasses from him for a cigarette. So he did, and I bought those field glasses. And we took off and went out in the woods where we had been working. There was a big depressed area in there. And some of these Russian women prisoners came out there with us too. And we built fur lean-tos in there. And we figured we'd spend the night out there and wait till the Russian army came through. We didn't want to be in the way of the Russians and Germans collided. And so we stayed the night out there. And the next day, we could hear a lot of traffic. And this one kid, he borrowed my glasses. He was going to go look and see what it was. And pretty soon he came back, and there was a German officer with him. And the German officer looked and saw what we were, and because he had spotted this kid. It's a wonder he hadn't got himself killed. And he practically told him, stay where you are, stay out of the trouble. And then he left. Well, pretty soon the noise sounded different and couldn't stand it. We didn't know what's going on again. And so this kid took off again. I said, well, don't you lose my glasses. But pretty soon he came back. This time he had a Russian soldier with him. And first thing he did when he called me is, any of you guys got a watch, don't let this guy see it because he don't care who you are. He wants a watch. So anyhow, he came in there, and these Russian women, they just fell all over him, because he was their hero. And they apparently told him about the old German chef that took care of all of us people in this area. And pretty soon he left, and pretty soon he came back, and he was riding the chef's horse, wearing the chef's boots, dangling the chef's watch. He'd found him, and they had done him in. So when we left there and we walked back into Crumel, we went by the lake, and here we saw his body floating in the lake. And so we didn't know what really we should do now, and so we decided we'd go into the next biggest town and see if we couldn't find some kind of a Russian headquarters or something, and find out what we were supposed to do, or where we should go. And so we did, and we finally found a schoolhouse, and there seemed to be something going on there. And we went in, and this one kid who could speak Polish could speak pretty well with the Russians. And so they explained to him what we were and what we wanted. And we asked him what we should do. They just held out a rifle, says, come fight with us. Well, no thanks. We thought we'd better get on our way on back to the Americans. So they told us that the Americans were waiting for them at the Elbe River. And so we stayed there for that night, and 6 of us found bicycles, and the other 6 guys got a horse and wagon. And we took off then and followed the Russian army going west. And that was an experience following the Russian army. When there was some Yugoslavian women there who latched on to us because they were afraid of the Russians, and they wanted to travel with us. Well, they ended up hogging the wagon. The other guys had to walk. And where the Russians had killed Germans along the road, they left them right on the road like roadkill, ran right over them. And every time these Yugoslavian women would just see this, and they'd get sick, and we'd have to stop. Well, after one day of that, the next morning, that night, they stayed in one house, we stayed in another one. Next morning, we got up early and left without them. And so we followed the Russian army there for 4 days. And when we went through one little village, we stopped for lunch. And we looked around, we found some eggs and fried them and cooked them. And we saw this one Russian grab a German girl and take her into a house and raped her. And when he came back over, and so one of the guys asked him, why did you do this? And he said that the Germans had burned his folks' farm, killed his parents, and 17 Germans had raped his sister and killed her. He was out for all the revenge he could get. And While we were also here cooking this dinner, this other old Russian was telling us something. Of course, none of us could understand him. He was just going away, and we'd kind of ignoring him, still cooking and trying to fix something to eat. And all of a sudden, he pulls out his pistol, fires 2 shots. We all hit the floor. I guess he was just trying to make a point, I guess, but it scared the heck out of us. But it was quite interesting following the Russian army. And at one village we came to, we found a whole line of Russians lined up. They were taking turns riding the few bicycles that they had found. And they didn't know how to ride bicycles. They were like kids on Christmas morning. These people had grown up as real poverty-stricken peasants, they didn't know about anything almost. And it was hilarious watching them trying to ride these bicycles. So the 6 of us who knew how to had bicycles, we couldn't resist showing off. We did all the tricks that we knew as kids, because we'd stand up on the seat and ride them, and get up and ride side saddle, or turn around and ride backwards on the handlebar. Did everything we could, and they were just dumbfounded. And there was a young Russian officer who come by and saw us. He thought we were circus. But when he found out we were Americans, he was just tickled pink. And he had an all-chrome bicycle, beautiful thing. And he said that he had American equipment that he was so proud of. And he wanted us to show it to us. He wanted us to join him out where he said he had 3 tanks bivouacked out here on the edge of town. So we started following, and there was an old rutted road, and the only way he could ride, we'd get on there and go as fast as he could, and then he'd hit a rut or something, and he'd take a spill, and we'd wait while he picked himself up and got going again. And we got out here to where he had these 3 American tanks, and as soon as he got there, he gave some orders, and the men there kind of disappeared for a little bit. And he was showing us his equipment, and he explained that the only English he knew was he got out of the manuals for this equipment. And everything was Dodge and Studebaker Dubray, which was excellent. And pretty soon his men came back, and they had served us a fried chicken dinner, all on fancy German china. They had a little crank-up phonograph they'd cranked up, and had German records playing Deutschland über alles. And they had apparently brought us a safe out there and broke it open, because there was German paper money scattered all over the place. And I had picked up a great big, I think it was 100,000 mark note. I was going to bring it home for a souvenir. And anyway, in the course of while we ate there, this one Polish kid was conversing with him, and the Russian men were kind of somewhat reserved, they didn't really know what they should act toward us like. So finally they asked him, what were we going to do when we got home? And the kid told him, well, we're going to find a good girl and get married and raise a bunch of kids. Man, those guys just exploded with happiness. Oh, they were just slapping your back, and they couldn't be more friendly. That's just what they wanted to do too. Well, we thought that was kind of unusual, but afterwards, when we saw how the Cold War developed, we realized that they had been already fed a bunch of propaganda about Americans, and the Russians did not want them to mingle with Americans, because this Russian officer, he had looked so forward to meeting the Americans, and he was so disappointed because they stopped him right there and wouldn't let him go any further. So anyhow, we continued on, and we eventually got to the Elbe River, and there was the big bridge across the river was bombed out, of course. We couldn't get across. We didn't know what do we do? So while we were pondering what to do next, a Belgian POW came along, and he said there was an American river crossing up the river about 3 kilometers. Okay, so we headed up that way. And we'd gone a little ways and still was wondering if this is where it was, or if it was on a wild goose chase or what. We met a German civilian, and we asked him, oh yes, it's just right here. He says, you can leave the horse and wagon with me. He says, you won't need it anymore. But if you want the horse and wagon, you come get it. Well, we took off then, and we noticed he was following us, so we thought, maybe they're right. And in just a little while, over across the trees along the river there above him, we could see an American flag. And you've probably heard an awful lot of statements about what the flag means and how wonderful the sight of it is. But I can tell you that never looked better to anybody than it looked to us at that time. That was the most wonderful sight we ever seen. That was represented home and everything. Well, us on the bicycles, we were paddling as fast as we could go. A couple of them had flat tires, and they were rattling on the rim on that old gravel road. And the old horse and wagon, we had that horse at a full gallop, and the old wagon was just a bouncing and flying. And we got up there, and here was a big kind of an opening. And we turned into this opening, and tied up at the river's edge was a big ocean-going yacht. And over in this other corner of this opening was a Russian band all mounted on horseback. We come rolling down in there, and there was 4 GIs there. 2 of them were passed out cold on the beach and with pink vomit. They'd been drinking with the Russians. The other 2 were standing there looking over them, looking after them. And we come down there, and it's, hey, what are you guys standing here for? Why didn't you come get us? You know, and they said, well, this is as far as they would let us come, he said. And they said, well, let's get on that boat and go get across and get them on the other side. Oh, he said, don't do that. He said, there's an American general down there who's entertaining a Russian general. He says, we'll get you some transportation. So they went up on the boat, and they'd radioed across, and they sent 2 assault boats with outboard motors over. And we got on those, and they took us across the other side, and we were finally in American hands again.
So how long a period was that, from the time you were captured to?
From the time I was captured till my liberation date was 4.5 months. It seemed like 45 years. It was the longest period of my life. I look back now and think, well, that wasn't so long. But boy, it only takes one day of that kind of life to make too much.
Now you showed some letters your mom had tried to write you, but her letters were returned.
Yeah.
So for a long time, your mom didn't even know you were alive.
They didn't know I was alive all the time. They allowed us to, in the prison camp, they allowed us to write a letter and a postcard. And then when I was on the farm, I did too. And none of them got out until one letter got out. Apparently the American advancing army had liberated something and found them in somewhere and sent them out. And so one letter got home just about a day or 2 before the actual war ended. And that was their first knowledge that I was alive. So somebody told my mother to go tell the Red Cross. So she did. Well, the Red Cross apparently informed the Army. The Army sent the folks a telegram saying I was a prisoner of war. But the war was all over.
I love the efficiency of the military sometimes.
Yeah.
Wow. So how long did it take you to get home then?
A month.
So another month now.
We stayed from this place. They hauled us by truck to the town of Hildesheim, and we waited there at an airport, an old German airfield on Hildesheim. And that's where I lost that 100,000 mark note. Some gypsy stole it from me. Then they flew us out of there in C-47s to Camp Lucky Strike in Le Havre. And we waited there about 2 weeks. And while we were there, they offered us a 3-day pass to Paris or a 7-day leave to England. But if you took this, you'd get on the end of the list to get on a boat. Darn few guys took it, almost no. We did have, when traveling in our group, when we were following the Russians and working on the Arbeitskommando, we had 1 Frenchman and 1 Englishman, both who were posing as Americans, because they figured when the war was over, they were going to get sent back to America, and the way they were going to come here. Well, when we got across the Elbe River and they loaded us into trucks to take us to a place to feed us, a British officer walked over to the truck and he says, "I say there, are there any British lads in there?" Gee, the Englishman couldn't stand it. He popped up like a jack-in-the-box, spouted off his name, rank, and the unit. And the officer says, "Come with me," and that's the last we saw of him. And then when we got to Camp Lucky Strike, the Frenchman, he couldn't resist. He took the 3-day pass to Paris, and we never saw him again. But then we waited there, like I said, about 2 weeks. They put us on an old Liberty ship, not a Liberty, but a Victory. It was an old slow freighter. It took 2 weeks to come across the Atlantic on it. And then we got into New York, and we were there for about a day, and then they put us on a troop train to come back to Fort Lewis. So it took about 4 days. So by the time we got home, we'd been pretty well fed.
Pretty well fed, and your body starting to
Yeah.
readjust now, because that had to be hard on your body too.
It was. And like I say, all those things we dreamed about eating, well, you just couldn't accomplish it. Couldn't do it. There were a few guys that I know that ended up in the hospital because they couldn't handle the eating. And but I made out all right. They sent us home and with a 70-day temporary duty, and all this time when I got to New York, I could have got a telephone home, but I was afraid to. I was afraid that there might be bad news. I was worried about what might have happened at home. And I didn't want my dream shattered, I guess, or something. I really don't know. Couldn't do it. And so when we finally got out here to Fort Lewis, I still didn't get on the phone. They processed us pretty fast, gave us some temporary money to last us, and give us our orders. And as soon as I got that in hand, boy, I hopped on a base bus there and out to the highway and started hitchhiking. And some GIs came along and picked me up and brought me to downtown Olympia. When we got downtown Olympia, it just felt like you crawled into a nice, warm, comfortable, warm bed. To see everything familiar and then realize I was back home again, oh, what a feeling it had. And I couldn't stand it any longer then. I finally went to a phone and called up, and my mom answered the phone, and man, I was so happy, because she was the one I was worried about how it was going to affect her. And she said, "Where are you? Are you in New York?" She said, "We just got a telegram or something. It was from the Army just the other day saying that you would be on your way shortly." I said, "No, I'm downtown Olympia. Can you come get me?" Yes. Well, I was over on the east end of the 4th Street at that place, and I walked over to her by the corner of Sylvester Park. By the time I got there, they had driven from Tumwater to Olympia. And oh, what a wonderful feeling. It was one of those moments you'd like to have last forever.
Well, were there other siblings in your family? Were you the only child?
I had a sister.
A sister.
And she was married, and her husband was in the Army, but he was a medic in a quartermaster outfit. And most all of my cousins were all in the service too, but none of them went through what I had to go through.
Do you carry any of that with you today? Well, I mean, I know you do a life experience. I got to switch tapes here again. Just